Charles moved methodically through the sleek offices of TechFront, one of San Francisco's leading technology companies. His mop glided across the polished floors, erasing the day's footprints and coffee spills. As he worked, laughter erupted from a nearby conference room. Charles didn't need to look up to know it was Tom and his cohort of executives. Tom, the CEO's son, emerged from the room, his designer suit a stark contrast to Charles's plain uniform. "Hey, Janitor, make sure you get that corner over there. Wouldn't want Daddy's company looking shabby, would we?" Tom's voice dripped with sarcasm as his colleagues snickered behind him. Charles tightened his grip on the mop handle but kept his face neutral. He'd learned long ago that engaging only made things worse. Instead, he focused on his task, allowing his mind to drift to a time when he commanded respect in rooms like these. Years ago, Charles had been a software engineer, his code shaping the digital landscape. He remembered the thrill of solving complex problems, the camaraderie of his team, and the satisfaction of seeing his work make a difference. Now he watched as younger versions of himself strode through the halls, oblivious to the man who cleaned up after them. As Charles moved to another section of the office, he overheard snippets of conversation. Words like critical failure and system crash floated through the air, accompanied by tones of panic. He glanced up to see executives rushing towards the main conference room, their faces etched with worry. Moments later, an announcement blared through the building's speakers. "Attention all staff. We are facing a potential crisis with our flagship product. All department heads, please report to the main conference room immediately." The atmosphere in the office shifted instantly. The usual buzz of productivity gave way to a tense silence, punctuated by hurried footsteps and worried whispers. Charles watched as Tom, his earlier bravado replaced by visible anxiety, hurried past without so much as a glance. As the crisis unfolded around him, Charles continued his work, invisible to the panicking employees. Yet as he cleaned, he couldn't help but overhear the frantic discussions. He recognized the problem they were describing. It was similar to an issue he had solved years ago at his previous company. For a moment, Charles allowed himself to imagine stepping into that conference room, offering his expertise and saving the day. But reality quickly reasserted itself. He was just the janitor to them, nothing more. With a resigned sigh, he pushed his cart to the next area, leaving behind the chaos of a company on the brink of disaster. Inside the main conference room, tension hung thick in the air. The company's top executives sat around a long table, their faces a mix of confusion and desperation. Tom, usually confident to the point of arrogance, fidgeted nervously in his chair. "We're looking at a complete system failure within 48 hours if we don't find a solution," the head of engineering explained, his voice strained. "Our entire user base could lose access to their data. The PR nightmare alone could sink us." Suggestions flew across the table, each one shot down as quickly as it was proposed. The CEO, Tom's father, grew increasingly agitated with each passing minute. "We've got the best minds in the industry in this room," he growled. "How is it possible that none of you can fix this?" As the meeting dragged on, frustration mounted. Tom, eager to prove himself, threw out ideas that only demonstrated his lack of technical understanding. The other executives, while more knowledgeable, seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the problem. In a moment of desperation, Sarah, the head of human resources, spoke up. "I know this might sound crazy, but what about that janitor? Charles, I think his name is. I've noticed him lingering during our development meetings. He always seems to be cleaning the same spot, like he's listening in." The room fell silent. Tom scoffed. "The janitor? Are you serious? What could he possibly know about our systems?" Sarah persisted. "I'm just saying, he's been here for every stage of this product's development. Maybe he's picked up something we've missed." The CEO, at his wit's end, nodded. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything. Someone go get him." Minutes later, Charles was escorted into the conference room. The executives stared at him, a mix of skepticism and desperate hope in their eyes. Tom, in particular, couldn't hide his disbelief at seeing the janitor standing at the head of the table. Charles stood there, mop still in hand, feeling the weight of their stares. He'd dreamed of this moment, being back in a room like this, respected for his mind rather than his ability to keep the floors clean. But now that it was happening, he felt a wave of uncertainty. "Charles," the CEO began, his tone a forced politeness, "we understand you've been present during many of our development meetings. We're facing a critical issue with our main product. Do you have any insights that might help us?" The room held its breath. Charles looked around, seeing the faces of those who had ignored or belittled him for months. His gaze lingered on Tom, whose expression was a mix of confusion and dawning realization. Taking a deep breath, Charles set down his mop. "Actually," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I believe I might be able to help." Charles took a moment to gather his thoughts, acutely aware of the skeptical gazes fixed upon him. Then, with a clarity that surprised even himself, he began to explain the intricacies of the system failure. "The issue isn't in the core algorithm," Charles stated, his voice growing more confident with each word. "It's in the way the system handles data caching under high load. You're experiencing cascade failures because the cache isn't clearing properly, causing memory leaks." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and grudging respect dawning on their faces. Charles continued, outlining a potential fix that involved rewriting a portion of the caching mechanism and implementing a more robust error handling system. As he spoke, Charles could see the gears turning in the minds of the engineering team. They began to nod, asking pointed questions that Charles answered with ease. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Tom, however, wasn't ready to accept this turn of events. "Wait a minute," he interrupted, his voice tinged with disbelief and a hint of anger. "How does a janitor know all this? This has to be some kind of joke." Before Charles could respond, Sarah from HR spoke up. "I don't think it matters how he knows it, Tom. What matters is that he might have just saved our company from a catastrophic failure." The CEO nodded in agreement, his earlier skepticism replaced by cautious optimism. "Charles, can you work with our engineering team to implement these changes?" Charles felt a surge of confidence. "Yes, sir. I'd be happy to." As the meeting continued, Charles found himself at the center of the discussion. He sketched out diagrams on the whiteboard, fielded questions from the team, and proposed additional improvements to the system. The executives who had previously ignored his existence now hung on his every word. Tom sat silently, his earlier bravado deflated. He watched as Charles commanded the room with a quiet authority, realizing that he had grossly misjudged the man he'd dismissed as just a janitor. As the session wound down, the CEO addressed the room. "I think we all owe Charles a debt of gratitude. Not only has he potentially saved our product, but he's also taught us a valuable lesson about making assumptions." Charles felt a mix of emotions wash over him: pride in his abilities, satisfaction at finally being recognized, but also a tinge of sadness for the months of disrespect he'd endured. As he looked around the room, he saw a range of expressions: respect, curiosity, and in some cases, shame. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Charles was no longer invisible. As he left the conference room, he knew his life at TechFront would never be the same. The challenge now would be navigating this new reality, balancing his newfound respect with the lingering resentment from months of mistreatment. But for now, he allowed himself a small smile. He had taken the first step towards reclaiming his true identity and worth. In the days following the crisis meeting, Charles found himself in a whirlwind of activity. The company's leadership, recognizing his expertise, quickly assigned him to work with the engineering team to implement his proposed solutions. As he settled into his new role, Charles couldn't help but notice the stark contrast to his previous position. One constant source of support during this transition was Maya, a young intern who had always treated Charles with kindness, even when he was just the janitor in everyone else's eyes. Now, as they worked side by side to develop a comprehensive action plan, their friendship deepened. "I always knew there was more to you than met the eye," Maya said one evening as they pored over lines of code. "The way you carried yourself, the attention you paid to details, it didn't fit the image of a simple janitor." Charles smiled, appreciating her perceptiveness. "I tried to keep a low profile. It was easier that way, given the circumstances." As they continued working, Maya shared her own story. "My parents faced similar discrimination when they first immigrated here," she explained. "Highly educated professionals reduced to menial jobs because of their accents and skin color. It's why I'm so passionate about changing the tech industry from within." Charles nodded, understanding all too well the challenges she described. Their shared experiences created a bond, driving them to work even harder on not just fixing the immediate problem, but also on developing strategies to make the company more inclusive. As word spread about Charles's contributions, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. People who had previously ignored him now sought out his opinions. Even Tom, the CEO's son who had been Charles's most vocal tormentor, seemed to be re-evaluating his stance. One afternoon, as Charles was leaving a meeting, Tom approached him. "Hey, Charles," he said, his usual cockiness noticeably absent. "I was wondering if we could talk for a minute." Charles regarded him warily. "What about?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you. The way I treated you before, it wasn't right. I'm sorry." Charles listened to Tom's apology, his face impassive. While a part of him appreciated the gesture, years of mistreatment weren't easily forgotten. "Thank you for saying that, Tom," he replied evenly. "But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about change, show it through your behavior." As Tom nodded and walked away, Charles couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was glad to see signs of change, but he remained cautious. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with opportunities to right past wrongs, but also fraught with potential setbacks. For now, Charles focused on the task at hand, determined to prove his worth not just as a problem solver, but as a catalyst for change within the company. In the weeks that followed, TechFront underwent a significant transformation. Recognizing the need for a more inclusive work environment, the company initiated a series of diversity and inclusion workshops. To everyone's surprise and some people's discomfort, Charles was asked to be one of the main speakers. The first workshop was held in the company's largest conference room, packed with employees from every department. Charles stood at the podium feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. He began by sharing his own story, his background as a software engineer, the circumstances that led to him becoming a janitor, and the daily struggles he faced in a workplace that didn't value him. As Charles spoke, the room fell silent. Many employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own behavior in his descriptions. Others nodded in understanding, their own experiences mirroring Charles. From his seat in the back of the room, Tom watched intently. For the first time, he was hearing the full impact of his actions and those of his colleagues. The reality of the toxic culture he had helped perpetuate began to sink in. Following Charles's presentation, other employees began to share their stories. A woman from marketing described the subtle sexism she encountered in meetings. An Asian American developer talked about being constantly mistaken for other Asian employees. A transgender individual from HR detailed the challenges of transitioning while working at the company. As the workshop progressed, Maya stood up to speak. She shared her family's story of immigration and discrimination, drawing parallels to the experiences of many in the room. Her passion for change was evident, inspiring others to join the conversation. Inspired by the openness of the workshop, Charles and Maya decided to create a video showcasing the diverse talents and backgrounds of TechFront's employees. They spent evenings and weekends interviewing willing participants, editing footage, and crafting a narrative that highlighted the strength that comes from diversity. When the video was finally shown to the entire company, the impact was immediate and profound. Employees saw their colleagues in a new light, recognizing the unique perspectives and skills each person brought to the table. The video ended with a powerful message. Our differences are our strength. Embrace diversity, foster inclusion, drive innovation. As the lights came up, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The CEO, visibly moved, stood up to address the company. This video has shown us who we truly are and who we can be, he said. From this day forward, TechFront commits to being a leader in diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. For Charles, watching the reactions to the video was a vindication of sorts. The company was finally beginning to see what he had known all along, that true innovation comes from valuing every voice regardless of their position or background. As people filed out of the viewing, discussing what they'd seen with newfound enthusiasm, Charles caught Tom's eye. The young executive nodded respectfully, a gesture that spoke volumes about his changing perspective. While challenges remained, it was clear that TechFront was on a new path, one that Charles was proud to help shape. The transformation at TechFront continued to unfold in the following months. Charles, once invisible to most of his colleagues, now found himself at the center of the company's evolving culture. His insights were sought after not just for technical problems, but for broader issues of workplace dynamics and innovation. During a product development meeting, Charles proposed an idea for a new feature that would make their software more accessible to users with disabilities. The room fell silent as he outlined his vision, drawing on his experiences both as an engineer and as someone who had been marginalized. This isn't just about compliance, Charles explained. It's about expanding our user base and creating a product that truly serves everyone. We have an opportunity to lead the industry in inclusive design. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and Charles was given the green light to lead the project. As he assembled his team, he made a point of including voices that had previously been overlooked in the company. Meanwhile, Tom was going through his own transformation. The arrogant executive who had once looked down on Charles was now making efforts to change. One afternoon, he approached Charles's desk. "Charles, I've been thinking," Tom began, his usual bravado replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. "I'd like to work with you on the accessibility project. I think I could learn a lot, and maybe I could help bridge the gap between the old guard and the new direction we're taking." Charles regarded Tom carefully. He appreciated the gesture, but years of mistreatment had taught him to be cautious. "I'm glad you're interested in the project, Tom," he replied. "But trust is earned. If you're serious about this, you'll need to prove it through your actions, not just your words." Tom nodded, accepting the challenge. "I understand. I'm ready to put in the work." As they began collaborating, Charles kept a watchful eye on Tom's behavior. To his surprise, Tom showed genuine commitment, actively listening to team members he would have previously ignored and contributing valuable insights. While Charles remained guarded, he couldn't deny that Tom's involvement was helping to accelerate the project's acceptance among the more resistant members of the company. As the weeks passed, Charles found his relationship with Maya deepening. They often stayed late at the office, brainstorming ideas for making TechFront more inclusive. During one such session, Maya shared her dream of creating a mentorship program for underrepresented groups in tech. "Imagine if we could provide guidance and opportunities to people who might otherwise be overlooked," she said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We could change the face of the industry." Charles nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. "It's a brilliant idea, Maya, and I think we're in a position to make it happen." Together, they began drafting a proposal for the mentorship program, drawing on their own experiences and the lessons learned from TechFront's transformation. As they worked, Charles couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. From a janitor silently observing the company's flaws to a respected leader driving change, his journey was a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of creating inclusive spaces. Yet he knew the work was far from over. Changing a company's culture was a continuous process, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But looking at Maya's determined face and thinking of the allies he'd found along the way, Charles felt ready to face whatever came next. The future of TechFront was being rewritten, and this time everyone would have a chance to contribute to the story. Months of hard work culminated in a company-wide presentation where TechFront would unveil its new direction and initiatives. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as employees filed in, curious about the changes they'd been hearing whispers of for weeks. To everyone's surprise, it was Charles who took the stage to deliver the keynote address. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by a sharp suit that symbolized his new role in the company. As he stepped up to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. "A year ago," Charles began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I stood in the back of rooms like this, invisible to most of you. Today I stand here not just as a software engineer or a project leader, but as a testament to what can happen when a company truly embraces diversity and inclusion." As Charles spoke, he wove together the story of his personal journey with the larger narrative of TechFront's transformation. He highlighted the challenges they'd faced, the resistance they'd overcome, and the innovations that had sprung from their new, inclusive approach. "We've learned that diversity isn't just a buzzword or a quota to be filled," Charles continued. "It's the key to unlocking creativity, solving complex problems, and building products that serve all of humanity, not just a select few." He went on to outline the company's new initiatives, the accessibility features that were already garnering industry attention, the mentorship program he and Maya had developed, and a commitment to transparent hiring and promotion practices. As Charles spoke, he could see the impact of his words on the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others wiped away tears. Even those who had been skeptical of the changes seemed moved by the vision he presented. "But this is just the beginning," Charles said, his voice rising with passion. "We have the opportunity to set a new standard for the tech industry, to show that innovation and inclusion go hand in hand, that when we value every voice, when we create space for every perspective, we all rise together." As he concluded his speech, the auditorium erupted in applause. Employees rose to their feet, their cheers echoing through the room. Charles stood at the podium, overwhelmed by the response. He saw Maya in the front row, her face beaming with pride. Tom was there too, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. In that moment, Charles felt the weight of the past year, the struggles, the doubts, the small victories, and the big breakthroughs. He had gone from being silenced to having his voice amplified, from being overlooked to being celebrated. As the applause continued, Charles realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, every voice that had been silenced, every talent that had been overlooked. It was a victory for all of them. When the noise finally died down, Charles stepped away from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had done more than just give a speech. He had helped chart a new course for TechFront and potentially for the entire tech industry. As he made his way off the stage, Charles was met with handshakes, hugs, and words of congratulation. He accepted them graciously, but his mind was already racing ahead to the work that still needed to be done. The speech was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in turning these words into lasting change. But looking at the inspired faces around him, Charles felt ready for that challenge. TechFront had taken its first steps towards a more inclusive future, and he was proud to be leading the way. In the days following Charles's powerful speech, a palpable shift occurred within TechFront. Employees from all levels of the company approached Charles, sharing their own stories and expressing their commitment to the new vision he had laid out. One afternoon, as Charles was leaving a strategy meeting, he found Tom waiting for him in the hallway. The CEO's son, once his tormentor, now stood before him with an air of humility. "Charles, I don't know where to begin," Tom started, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your speech really opened my eyes. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now how wrong I've been. Not just in how I treated you, but in my whole approach to leadership and teamwork." Charles listened carefully, his expression neutral. He had heard apologies before, but something in Tom's demeanor seemed different this time. Tom continued, I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of this change. I want to learn from you, to understand how I can be a better ally and leader. If you're willing, I'd like to work more closely with you on implementing these new initiatives." Charles considered Tom's words. He could see the genuine remorse in the younger man's eyes, but years of mistreatment had taught him to be cautious. "I appreciate your words, Tom," Charles replied evenly. "But as I've said before, real change comes through actions, not just words. If you're serious about this, show me through your work and your behavior." Tom nodded, accepting the challenge. "I understand. I'm ready to put in the effort and learn. I want to be part of making TechFront truly inclusive." As Tom walked away, Charles felt a mix of emotions. He was glad to see signs of change in someone who had once been his most vocal critic, but he also knew that true transformation would take time and consistent effort. Over the next few weeks, Charles observed Tom closely. To his surprise, he saw genuine attempts at change. Tom actively participated in diversity workshops, sought out perspectives from employees at all levels, and even volunteered to lead a task force on inclusive hiring practices. Meanwhile, the company began implementing the new policies and initiatives Charles had outlined in his speech. The mentorship program he and Maya had developed was launched, pairing experienced employees with newcomers from underrepresented groups. The accessibility features Charles had championed were integrated into the company's flagship product, receiving praise from both users and industry experts. As these changes took root, Charles found himself in a new role, not just as a technical leader, but as a cultural ambassador for the company. He was invited to speak at industry conferences, sharing TechFront's journey and inspiring other companies to follow suit. One evening, as Charles was preparing for an upcoming conference, Maya knocked on his office door. "Charles, have you seen the latest employee satisfaction survey?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Charles shook his head and Maya handed him a tablet. As he scrolled through the results, a smile spread across his face. Employee morale had skyrocketed, with particular improvements in areas related to inclusion and belonging. "This is incredible," Charles said, looking up at Maya. "We're really making a difference." Maya nodded, her own smile mirroring his. "And it's just the beginning. We're setting a new standard for the industry." As they discussed the survey results and planned their next steps, Charles felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The company he had once cleaned in silence was now leading the charge for inclusivity in tech. There was still work to be done, challenges to overcome, but for the first time in years, Charles felt truly optimistic about the future. He knew that the road ahead would not always be smooth. Change of this magnitude would inevitably face resistance and setbacks. But looking at the progress they had already made, Charles felt ready to face whatever came next. TechFront was evolving, and he was proud to be at the forefront of that evolution. As TechFront's transformation gained momentum, not everyone was pleased with the new direction. Charles soon found himself facing an unexpected challenge from the highest levels of the company. One afternoon, Tom burst into Charles's office, his face a mix of anger and frustration. "Charles, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Charles looked up from his computer, surprised by Tom's agitated state. "What's going on, Tom?" Tom paced the room, running his hands through his hair. "It's my father. He's furious about all these changes. He thinks we're pandering to political correctness and diluting the company culture. He wants me to put a stop to it." Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. He had anticipated some resistance, but he hadn't expected it to come from the CEO himself. "What did you tell him?" Charles asked cautiously. Tom stopped pacing and met Charles's gaze. "I told him he was wrong, that these changes are making us stronger, more innovative, but he wouldn't listen. He threatened to remove me from my position if I don't fall in line." Charles leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. "So what are you going to do?" Tom's response surprised him. "I'm going to stand my ground. These past few months, working with you and the team, I've seen firsthand the positive impact of our new approach. I can't go back to the way things were. I won't." Charles studied Tom's face, seeing the determination there. It was a far cry from the arrogant executive he had known before. "That's a brave stance, Tom. But are you sure you're prepared for the consequences?" Tom nodded firmly. "I am. My father built this company, but he's stuck in the past. If we want to remain competitive and attract the best talent, we need to embrace diversity and inclusion. I'm willing to fight for that, even if it means risking my position." As Tom spoke, Charles felt a newfound respect for him. The transformation he had witnessed in Tom over the past months wasn't just surface level. It was a fundamental shift in values and priorities. "All right," Charles said, standing up. "If you're serious about this, we need to develop a strategy. We can't let all our progress be undone by old-school thinking, even if it's coming from the top." Over the next few days, Charles, Tom, and Maya worked tirelessly to prepare a comprehensive presentation for the board of directors. They gathered data on the positive impacts of their initiatives, from improved employee satisfaction to increased innovation and market share. As the day of the board meeting approached, tension in the office was palpable. Employees who had embraced the changes worried about a potential rollback, while those who had resisted saw an opportunity for a return to the old ways. Tom, despite his outward confidence, was visibly nervous. The night before the meeting, he confided in Charles. "What if I can't convince them? What if I lose everything I've worked for?" Charles placed a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "Remember why we're doing this, Tom. It's not just about you or me. It's about creating a company where everyone has the opportunity to contribute and succeed. That's worth fighting for." Tom nodded, drawing strength from Charles's words. As they parted ways, both men knew that the next day would be a turning point, not just for them, but for the future of TechFront. The day of the board meeting arrived, bringing with it a tense atmosphere that permeated every corner of TechFront. As Charles and Tom made their way to the boardroom, they could feel the weight of expectation on their shoulders. This meeting would determine not just their own futures, but the direction of the entire company. The boardroom was imposing with its long mahogany table and high-backed leather chairs. The board members, mostly older men in expensive suits, watched impassively as Charles and Tom took their seats. At the head of the table sat Tom's father, the CEO, his face set in a stern expression. "Let's get started," the CEO said, his voice cold. "Tom, I believe you have some explanations to make about the recent changes in company policy." Tom stood, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "Thank you, Father. Members of the board, I'm here today to discuss the transformative initiatives we've implemented at TechFront over the past few months." As Tom began his presentation, Charles watched the faces of the board members. Some looked skeptical, others curious, and a few seemed outright hostile. Tom, however, spoke with a passion and conviction that Charles had never seen in him before. "Our diversity and inclusion initiatives aren't just about doing the right thing morally," Tom explained, presenting charts and graphs. "They're about positioning TechFront for the future. Our employee satisfaction is up 40%. Our innovation index has increased by 35%. And our market share in previously underserved demographics has grown by 25%. The CEO interrupted, his voice sharp. "Those are just short-term gains. What about our core business, our traditional customer base?" It was Charles's turn to speak. He stood facing the board with calm determination. "Our core business has actually strengthened," he said, pulling up new slides. "By broadening our perspective and including diverse voices in our development process, we've improved our products across the board. Customer satisfaction is up in all demographics." As Charles and Tom tag-teamed the presentation, providing data, anecdotes, and projections, they could see the mood in the room shifting. Even the most skeptical board members were leaning forward, engaged in the discussion. But the CEO wasn't ready to concede. "This is all well and good," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, But it doesn't change the fact that you fundamentally altered the culture of this company without board approval. Tom, you've overstepped your authority. And you, he pointed at Charles, you were hired as a janitor. Who gave you the right to influence company policy? The room fell silent. This was the moment of truth. Tom looked at Charles, then back at his father. I did, he said firmly. I gave Charles that right because he had the vision to see what this company could be, and I stand by that decision. The CEO's face reddened with anger. Then you leave me no choice. Tom, you're fired. And as for you, Charles, you'll be lucky if you're not sued for— Wait, a voice from the other end of the table interrupted. It was Sarah from HR, who had been quietly observing until now. Before we make any rash decisions, I think the board needs to hear the full story. Over the next hour, Sarah laid out the history of discrimination and missed opportunities at TechFront. She presented evidence of talented employees who had left due to the toxic culture, innovative ideas that had been overlooked due to bias, and the potential legal risks of continuing the old practices. As Sarah spoke, Charles could see the CEO's resolve weakening. The other board members were whispering among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they were hearing. Finally, the eldest board member spoke up. I've been with this company since the beginning, he said, his voice gravelly with age. And I can say without a doubt that what Tom and Charles have done here is not just right. It's necessary for our survival. The world is changing and we need to change with it. One by one, the other board members voiced their agreement. The CEO, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, slumped in his chair. Fine, he said eventually. The initiatives can continue, but I'll be watching closely. As the meeting adjourned, there was a sense of victory in the air, but also a realization of the work still to be done. Charles and Tom exchanged a look of relief and determination. They had won this battle, but the war for true inclusivity was far from over. Outside the boardroom, Maya was waiting, her face anxious. When she saw their expressions, she broke into a wide smile. You did it? She asked incredulously. Charles nodded, a smile spreading across his face. We did it. All of us. As they walked back to their offices, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From a janitor silently observing the flaws in the system to a key player in reshaping the company's future, his path had been far from easy. But looking at Tom and Maya beside him, and thinking of all the employees whose lives would be improved by these changes, he knew it had been worth every struggle. TechFront was entering a new era, one of true innovation and inclusivity, and Charles was proud to be leading the way.